We're in the midst of an epidemic, a serious epidemic. An epidemic so severe, it's like a runaway train running through our families and across our nation, leaving damage and destruction in its wake. This epidemic is the opioid epidemic, and what it's doing to our people from everyday walks of life, and how it's affecting them and their families. It's my purpose in this video to introduce you to a wonderful group, Moms Stop the Harm, and 4 of their most courageous people who've experienced this epidemic firsthand. They're going to share their story with you, a story of loss, grief, and suffering, but also hope and ideas to make things better in the future. The current state of the opioid crisis is so severe. In fact, in British Columbia alone, in 2017, over 1,400 people died from opioid overdoses. This is completely unacceptable. That's the rate of 4 people a day, or 1 every 6 hours. Unfortunately, this epidemic is rampant, and it can happen to anybody, unfortunately. No one is immune. And until we address the issues surrounding it, stigma, tainted drug supply with fentanyl and carfentanil, we're in for a long haul. The journey you're going to go on with me and these 4 wonderful women is a journey of understanding the current state that people that use drugs are in, and the stigma that they face when reaching out for help. Stigma is that awful, dirty word that means viewing others as less than yourself. Moms Stop the Harm is a network of Canadian families whose loved ones have died due to substance use or who hope for recovery. They call for an end to the failed war on drugs, which is a war on the people they love. Moms Stop the Harm envision a new approach based on reducing harm, where people who use drugs are treated with respect, compassion, and support. They advocate for a safer drug supply. One of their main goals is helping people that use drugs stay alive long enough to get help and treatment. It's my dream and hope, and that of Moms Stop the Harm, that with increased awareness of everybody in our society towards those that use drugs, towards the situation, well, I'm really optimistic we can make a difference. It starts with you, and it starts with me.
I'm glad that I stayed, because like when I think about like what my life would have looked like if I had left after like a week, like I really like to think about it. Yeah, I'm just like glad that I'm going to the door now, because it's like definitely the best decision. One of like the hardest decisions I've made in my life too. Thank you, crewmates. You guys are awesome. The crewmates, like the friends that I made here, were like the first real friends. I had it quite a while, so that was sweet. Yeah, just thank you for helping me with my decision for the door, because that was brutal. And thank you to all the staff for being awesome. Yeah, that's it. Cool.
I lost my son Joe at the age of 25 on December 11th, 2016 to a heroin fentanyl overdose.
In 2014, in February, my son Jordan overdosed on a mixture of prescription opioids that he had received from doctors. He died on February 4th. He was 25 years old.
I didn't, when I was young, I wasn't born, with this big dream of becoming a drug addict. I actually grew up with a lot of privilege, and I had a really, really good life. And, somewhere down the line, as my life progressed, some really awful things happened. And, I think when we're struck with adversity in our lives, everybody deals differently, right?
I first discovered Moms Stop the Harm when I went to a symposium about the opioid crisis. And I was asked to sit at the parents' table. They thought that's where I would be the most comfortable. And so my husband and I sat down, and different members of Mum Stop the Harm were at that table. They introduced themselves, and then they said the name of their child and the date that they had passed away. And as they went around the table and came to us, everyone at that table had lost someone to the crisis. And I found myself being embarrassed that Tara was still alive. And I said to them, I don't know if I belong here. My daughter's not dead yet. And then I heard myself say that and realized that I was just living one moment to moment, waiting for a phone call to tell me that she had also gone.
Joe had started using when he was 15 years old, so he was battling addiction for 10 years, and we spent a lot of time in the system when he was under 19 trying to get help for Joe, but found that it was like nothing we had ever come across before because there were so many doors closed in our face.
There is a backstory there. He, well, literally and figuratively, he had a back injury, and his doctor, our family doctor, prescribed oxycodone for him for a very long time. He was probably addicted within a week or so of those prescriptions. And the doctor continued to prescribe for him this very powerful opioid for about 6 or 7 months.
For me, you know, I married a woman I fell in love with and realized early in our relationship that she struggled with drug addiction. And unfortunately, after our marriage, she took her own life because she couldn't handle the chaos that using drugs created for her. She had a lot of trauma, and I just think it became too much. And so for me, I did my best to continue on with my life. You know, I went right back to work, but unfortunately I didn't deal with it right away. I kind of just pushed it to the side and pretended it didn't happen, and didn't realize that I had developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and then eventually ended up turning to drugs to deal with the emotional pain that, you know, the flashbacks and nightmares caused for me.
It was heart-wrenching for years. I spent 10 years waiting for a phone call and grieving my living child because I was so afraid that he would die or could die at any moment. The last year of Joe's life, we had gotten him into a rehab, but he just couldn't keep it together, and he got out of rehab and managed to stay clean for a while, but started using again. His drug use had gotten so severe, but really changed after he had a prescription for opioids from his wisdom teeth getting out. And he had mentioned to me at one time that he was buying Oxy after that on the streets because he liked using the opioids. And the deterioration seemed to get was getting rapid very fast. And I didn't know Joe had already overdosed 3 times, but I think he knew he was getting to the end of his own life. It was either stop or die, but how do you stop?
I tried many times to get treatment, but you know, every treatment program is different, and I'm a person that they call, like I have a lot of different diagnoses, right? I'm a very complex case. I'm also been diagnosed with complex trauma too, so often I would go to one treatment center and they'd only want to deal with the addiction, but then my mental health issues went untreated, as well as my physical issues went untreated, and so I'd either be asked to leave or I left because I got frustrated, and pretty soon I would be back out, you know, eventually on the street and back into the cycle of addiction. And every time I left, things would get worse. You know, initially I was able to maintain a home, and then I couldn't, and then while I was receiving disability benefits, my tolerance of my drug use would escalate to the point where I would spend my whole check in a day, and so I turned to selling drugs to support my habit. I turned to prostitution to support my habit. I sold off all my things, I stole from my family. I'm not proud of the things that I did to support my drug use, but at the time, for me, drugs kept me alive. I spun deeper and deeper into this awful depression where I would literally go to bed every night and pray not to wake up. And so when I woke up in the morning, it was the drugs that stopped me from taking my own life. They helped me tolerate the day-to-day things that, seemed completely insurmountable. And, it seems totally counterintuitive, but the drugs kept me alive long enough to the point where I was able to eventually get some help and create some stability, and now I'm alive today because I continue to use drugs. And a lot of people shake their heads and go, well, no, drug users just need to quit and then their lives are going to get better. Well, no, things get a lot worse before they get better.
Anything Joe set out to do in his life, he would master. He learned how to play guitar on his own and then competed in talent show contests, and he learned how to play chess, and next thing you know, he's in the provincials in Vancouver competing and placing. He was very intelligent and always very determined, and I think that was one of the hardest things for him with his addiction, was knowing that it was bigger than him, and it was something that he couldn't just beat. It wasn't enough. Will just wasn't enough.
After his death, and when I was in deep grief, my father sent me a newspaper clipping of a woman in Edmonton named Petra Schultz, who had lost her son to an opioid overdose as well. I had at that time no one to talk to really about this. I had no connection with anyone who had been through anything like this. Certainly people have lost children before, but drug overdose death is different. I got in touch with Petra. We eventually got in touch with another mom, Lorna Thomas, and after a lot of meetings and a lot of chat and going in one wrong direction in terms of advocacy, we centered out and we created Moms Stop the Harm. Our initial goal, and still is our goal, but we've evolved a little bit since then, I hope, is to advocate for better drug policies for people who use drugs. The goal is to keep people who use drugs alive. People with substance use disorder, people who are just experimenting, people who are just what we call weekend warriors, who just want to relax on a weekend. There are a lot of people who take certain drugs for those reasons.
I think something that really, one of the biggest barriers for me to getting the help that I needed was stigma. I would be in and out of the ER multiple different times, and because of the way that I presented, I was either like purple or red dotted, and I'm not sure what the difference is between those, but basically it was, this person is a known drug user, they're known to be violent, they're known to be a threat to themselves and others, proceed with caution, call security, don't give them pain medication. So even though I might be, coming in with a really visible, physical illness, because of that label on my chart, staff who didn't know me would approach me with this kind of hesitation or fear or judgment. So all of my past, transgressions were kind of held against me, and I'm the first to admit that I'm the last person that I would want to deal with, as a nurse or social worker or doctor coming into the ER. Usually by the time I've reached the emergency room, I'm at my absolute worst. I've had no sleep. Usually I'm either in withdrawal or I'm about to come into withdrawal. I'm in pain. And I am, quite violent. I mean, I would ask anyone out there to try to go a few days without sleep or food. and spend a few nights on the street selling your body, just, you know, hour to hour trying to make that $20 for your next hit. It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting, all the while dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, the flashbacks, that constant anxiety and urge to just want to self-destruct, you know.
If you think about addiction, we tend to just look at the worst case scenario, someone who's homeless or living on the streets, and we tend to judge and criticize. But if you actually think about what got a human being to be at that point in their lives, we might think differently, but we don't question, we just criticize. And that's where Joe's life was heading, and he had everything going for him other than the addiction, and the substance use just had that hold on him. And we felt that a more holistic approach was the way to go. If you're talking brain damage, a dependency on chemicals, you can no longer find happiness naturally within yourself because you require drugs to make you happy, or drugs to make you feel. When you're not using, you are inhuman. You don't even know your own self anymore. And that becomes the difficulty with getting off drugs. The night Joe passed away is a night I'll regret forever, because he had been home after a bad binge to stay with me. He'd been clean for a month and was doing really well. He had just turned 25, October 31st, 2016, and was determined to stay clean. And as a parent, I just couldn't say no, even though it was hard to have him in the home, because there is that element of distrust when someone uses. They steal from you. You don't know when the ball's going to drop, and it's hard to have that in the house when that's the last thing he needs in his recovery, is to have that guilt or that hanging over him from loved ones that have been affected by his use. He was doing really well and really determined to stay clean, but I think the reality of being clean and living clean is also very hard for them to accept, no matter how much they want it. It's like learning to live again, because your whole life has been consumed with drugs, and they've affected your every thought, your every emotion, your every reaction. And now you have to learn to live without that, and manage on your own. And I think that was still weighing him down and keeping him in denial. And when he started using again, at this point, I think I was frustrated, and I had asked him to leave because I didn't want him in the house while he was using heroin.
I think one of the hardest things I found was trying to find the balance between loving my daughter and hating the addiction, and keeping that in balance. Parents from Mums Up the Harm were so supportive and so welcoming, and it was the first time I felt like I had some people that I could actually talk to and feel sort of a kinship with. It's a club that you didn't ever think you were going to belong to, but you're together.
Stigma is one of the biggest barriers, is the biggest barrier in the overall picture that we face in trying to make change. The perception of a person who has substance use disorder is one of, if you think of the word junkie, if you think of the word drug addict even, you get a certain picture in your mind. And people who are making policy decisions are no different than the rest of us. They have their stigmatized thinking around people who use drugs. It's not a popular topic for change in government. Most of the public in Canada and elsewhere believe that people should just stop doing drugs. They believe that they're less than other people with other diseases. So stigma is the biggest barrier to change policy to compassionate, evidence-based treatments. Stigma exists in every level of government, in every level of society. One of our biggest goals is to reduce stigma, and to do that, we need to raise awareness of what addiction is, how it looks, how people who are addicted behave because of their addiction, and also to impart the absolute truth of the fact that the real person, the person who is suffering from substance use disorder, the real person is still in there. The person is not, he or she is not behaving in the way they are because they're bad or because they're criminals. It's because they're addicted and they need the drug that they're addicted to desperately. It's like being thirsty and not having water in sight. People get that desperate.
I think one thing that in light of the current crisis, the opiate overdose crisis, it's really important that we address stigma, and I think stigma is the reason why I put so much effort into hiding my drug use, from the people in my life, initially from my employers, from my friends. I was so afraid of losing. I mean, in the end, I did lose everyone. Not everyone, but I definitely have a community of people around me now, but I think I really do believe that stigma was why it took me so long to get help, and why the people in my life, struggled to support me through this. I think, most of the people that are dying right now are people that are, using in the privacy of their homes because they're too afraid to talk about their drug use. It's not the people that we see using like the safe consumption sites. Luckily, not a single person has died in a supervised or safe consumption site. But the folks that are dying are, not showing up to these sites, and I think a lot of that has to do with stigma and the fear of, losing support, losing jobs, losing face in the community.
But as a parent, you're left feeling like, what do I do for my child? How is this okay to have a human being who is being overtaken with drugs live in filth and live on the streets and live without anything to help them? Nobody wants them. You can't send them down to homeless shelters, and he himself didn't even want to go and be a part of what was available, and that just comes down to his own shame and the stigma.
I think I've come a long way around stigma myself, because before you entered, the world of substance use, I myself was nervous of, someone in the street. I didn't see them the way I see them now. The way I see them now is they're someone. They're somebody's child. They were once, carefree and innocent.
I remember once, having been revived from an overdose, and I had no shoes on, and it was pouring rain, and I had no way to get back down to the First United shelter. It was just one of the worst nights of my life. And this cab driver was sitting there with an empty cab, and I knocked on the window and was like, could you please just take me back to my shelter? No. And I looked at him, I'm like, do you have a daughter? And he looked up at me and met my eyes and said, yes. And I said, I'm someone's daughter. Please just take me somewhere I can contact my mom. And he didn't say another word. He let me in, and he didn't talk to me in the entire way, but he dropped me back off at First United Shelter. And then I was able to call you.
We realized that we needed to, all three of us needed to do something to mitigate the situation around opioids and families. We after many meetings and a couple of false starts, we realized that what we were thinking of doing, creating a network of families to advocate for better drug policy, was something that was needed, and there's a lot of parents out there, a lot of families who had lost loved ones already. So we have become quite a voice across Canada. There are over 500 families now in our network from coast to coast, mostly in British Columbia and Alberta. We have families joining often because they see us in the media. They see word of mouth, certainly, and social media. They get to know who we are. Joining Mums Stop the Harm for families is a way for them to understand that they aren't alone. It is a way for them to become advocates if they wish and if they're ready. There is no costs involved. We are simply gathering together people who need support and who wish to see things change.
After Joe had passed away, and one of the things I never wanted to do was write his obituary. And I wrote in his obituary that Joe had passed away after a 10-year addiction. And I was approached online by an organization called Mums Stop the Harm. They sent me a message, and what led from there has been life-changing for me, and probably what has kept me going, because I realized that there was so many people out there struggling just like me, but nobody was talking about it. And amongst my family, we would talk, but it was hard to talk to other people because nobody really understood what addiction was like, and they were full of ideas, and they should do this or they should do that, or you got to put boundaries, wait for them to hit rock bottom, all these things that we had already been through, and realized that they don't work. There is no rock bottom. They're living rock bottom. And it was amazing to me to see and meet all these people that had stories just like me and just like Joe.
The group that I am launching this fall is called Holding Hope. And I've had so many parents who have emailed me, phoned me, asked if they could meet me for coffee, because they just have no one to talk to. And they just need that person who will listen and not judge them for their situation with their loved one. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not sitting here, saying, oh, it was just, my love of Tara, and it was just so easy to do. It was very, very difficult.
Now that I'm able to describe, my experience to people, and I have a little bit more insight and understanding, the way I try to create a little bit of bridge of understanding and compassion with folks is, I'll say, usually, like, the way I see people is, I'm a person that loves to read, and I see people, each of us is individual books, and we all have a story, right? And, when I'm in the worst parts of my addiction, you are opening my story to the absolute worst chapter of my life. And one of my favorite quotes is, don't judge me by the chapter of my life that you walk in on. And so I just ask people to kind of think about that and think, what's the worst chapter of your life? Maybe it could be like a divorce, or a loss of a job, or a loss of a child, or a loss of a pet, and picture somebody walking in on that chapter of your story. Would you want them to be hard on you and judge you and criticize you and put you down? And no, you'd ask that person have empathy and compassion and understanding, and just treat you with a lot of love and care and help support you through it. And that's what I ask people.
When we're recovering from any sort of trauma, it's one or two steps forward, one step back, and any recovery is like that, including addiction. And when somebody relapses or uses again, it shouldn't be back to zero and start counting the days. They need to look at what triggered them and not be made to feel like they're a failure and not to feel shameful for their use, because all that does is perpetuate the need to use and drives them down further.
They say it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village or a community to save our children. We all have to be part of that solution. Every single one of us, in whatever way we can, whatever small way we can.
Mm-hmm.
Before being a co-founder of an organization and being asked on media my opinions and so on, I'm just a mom. I was a mom and I lost my son. That's my reason for even sitting here. We would be ever so happy to not have anyone else have to join Moms Stop the Harm. At the same time, people are advocating and they're doing so very effectively, and governments are listening. It's not an easy thing for families, for parents, and particularly moms, to continue to advocate and to continue to hear the stories of loved ones dying and so on and so forth. But we keep going. We're very motivated. I was asked once if I do this for my son, and I had to think about it for a minute, and I replied, no, actually, I do it for your son.